Hey, what's up everyone? So in the last episode, we were able to take a look at context API, and we also handled our state for our inputs here. Now in this episode, I want us to go ahead and perform a HTTP request to our backend or our API endpoints and be able to actually register a user. So I'll just dive right into my VS Code, and inside the client SRC folder, I'll add a new folder called utils, and here we will be creating some utility functions. I'll add a new file called services.js, and here is where we'll be performing our HTTP requests, that is post and get requests, and so on if we have more. So the first thing that I'll set here is a base URL for our backend. So right here I'll say export const base URL, and I'll set this to be equal to HTTP // localhost /5000 / API. So this is the base URL for our backend APIs, and it's good to set it here at one point so that whenever we want to change it, maybe when deploying the application, we can easily do so. So again now, right here, I'll create a function which will help us to perform the post request. So right here, I'll export const post request. So this is just a function. You can name it anything that you want, and we will be performing some async action, so I'll make it to be an async function, and it's another function here. It will accept two parameters. The first one is URL that we are making the request to, and then the other one is the body of the request. Now right here we will be using fetch to perform our post request, and it usually takes some time to process, so we can await it. I'll say await fetch, and we invoke it. Now right here, the first parameter is our URL, which we passed through the function, and then the other one is an object which has several properties. The first one is the method, so we specify here that we are performing a post request. So if we don't, it will try to perform a get request, so we specify its post. Then we set our headers and specify that we are working with JSON data. So right here I'll set headers, and we will say content hyphen type. This one will be application JSON, application stroke JSON. So this just specifies that we are working with a JSON data. And then the other one now is the body of our request, so we'll just say body. This will be a JSON object. Okay, cool. Now we will be getting a response from this, so we can say const response will be equal to await fetch. Cool. Now in this particular response, we can be able to extract our data. This is an object. It has a method called JSON. So right here we can get our data like this. We can say const data will be equal to await, and then right here we can just say response dot JSON. Okay, and then the other thing that you can just do is to return the data. So we can say return data. Cool. Okay, I should call this as a function like this. Yeah, there we go. So now this will actually be able to get our data, but I also want us to handle the error. So before we return the data, we can check if we have an error. So this response has a property called OK. If OK is true, that means that we don't have an error. If it's not, if it's false, it means that we have an error. So right here I'll say if OK is not true, so I'll say response right here dot OK. If it's not true, that means that we have an error, and we can set our error message here. So right here I'll first of all create a variable called let message, and then we will check if in our data here, which is from our response, if we actually have a message. So right here I'll say if data, and then I'll use this conditional check of message. And if we do have a message, we will set our message here to be equal to data.message. Now right here we'll also have else, and whatever we will do in here, we will set our message here to be equal to data. So let me try to explain to you what is actually happening here. So the case that we have message is equal to data is where we were setting our own custom messages right here. So if we go to server and we go to user controller, so these custom messages that we were setting here will be now our data. So that is why we are setting here our data to be equal to our message. Then if our data is the message, how we'll fetch here know that we have an error. So it will make use of the response here to determine the status of OK here. So response will make use of the status that we set right here, like 400, 400. This means that we have an error. Therefore, it will set OK to be false. And then we can perform a check and set it right here. Now, this other case where we have a message inside our data is for other error messages, maybe from the server, like this, the one that we don't have control of. So that is where we are setting the message here to be data.message. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And then so if we have a message, we will set this one to be either data.message or message to be data, and we can now return something from this particular check. So right here, after we perform this check here and set our message, we will return here, and whatever we will return is an object, and we will say in this object that the error here is true, meaning that we have an error, and the other thing that we can pass is the message. So error true, message, cool, and I save. So whatever will happen is that we will get to this point, but before we return the data, we perform a check. If we have an error, we set the message and we return this object. Therefore, it will not continue. It will not continue to this part. But if we don't have an error, this part will be skipped and we will return our data inside our response here. So this response will either be having the data or the error message, and we will be using this error right here to check if we have an error or we have the data itself. I hope that makes sense. Now, cool, we are done with this function. The next thing that we can do now is to make use of it. So what we will do, we will just go into our client, SRC, then the context here of context. And from here, we will be able to register a user. So the first thing, we will set some state for registering a user. So right here, we already have the state for the user. So if we successfully register the user, we'll just set the user. Else, we also need to have a state for error and for is loading status. Okay. So right here, let's add const, and we will say register error, like that. Then set register error. And we set this to be equal to use state, and initially the state for this one will be just null. So this is for handling the error when registering a user. Then we also add some loading status here. So we will say is register loading, and we set is register loading. So is set is register loading, and initially this will be false, so register is not loading by default. Okay, cool. Now we can come down here and we will create a function for us to be able to register a user. So I'll say const, and we will say register user. We set these to be equal to, we make use of use callback so that we can optimize our function. So we'll say use callback, we call it, and now in here we can add an arrow function as the first parameter, and also some dependency array which will be empty. So this arrow function here will be making use of async action. So we can say async arrow function, and we will be able now to perform our post request right here by just calling this particular post request here and passing everything that we need to pass. So it's pretty easy. Let's just do it. So right here we will just await our post request. We make sure that we click on it to auto import it at the top, and then we invoke it. So it's expecting the first parameter to be the URL, so we need to pass the URL. I'll use the backticks here, and I'll make use of the base URL. So right here I will read the variable like this. We will say base URL. We auto import it from, again, our services. We initially had it here. So after adding the base URL, we are supposed to add stroke users and then a stroke register, and this will hit our register API endpoint. So this is the first parameter of our post request here. Then the second parameter is a JSON object, which will be now our body. So right here, let's convert our login info, our register info, to a JSON object using JSON.stringify. So we invoke this, and then we had our register info right here. So we just pass it directly in this particular method. So right here I'll say register info. So after some time, this will give us a response, and the response will either be our error message here or our data here. So let's save that response in a constant. So we can say const response will be equal to await our post request. Cool. Now that we have this response, we can check if it's an error or if it's having our data. So before we set our state, right here, I'll say if response, remember it's an object, dot error exists. So if response dot error exists, remember we had set the error here, this one. So if this exists, then that means that our response is an error. So what we will do, we will set our error message using this right here, set register error to be our error message here. So I will return immediately so that I don't continue the execution of code below, and I'll say set register error, and I'll set it to be our response. Okay, cool. Now if this is not true, if we don't have an error, that means that we have our actual data, and what we need to do is to set our data to be equal to our user. So right here I'll say set user to be our response, and again we should be able to save now this user to the local storage. So I want to save the user to the local storage so that we don't keep registering a user or logging in a user whenever we refresh our browser. So we will be getting that user that is already stored in local storage. So let's save this user to the local storage. So right here we can say local storage. We already have access to this, and we will set item. The first parameter is a key, let it be user, and then the second parameter is a JSON object. So I'll just copy this and paste it here, but what I'll change is this register info, and I will say response. So what we are doing here, we are just saving the user into the local storage so that we can get the user back whenever we refresh our browser, and we don't have to log in again. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Cool. So we are setting the error, and we are setting our user both on local storage and state. Now the other thing that we should do is to actually handle the is loading status. So before we perform this request, which takes some time to process, we can set right here, set is loading, and we will set it to true. That means that our registration is going on. Then also we can make sure that we don't have an error when we are beginning to make the request. So we can set register error here to be null to begin with, and that way whenever we have an error, we'll come here and set it back to an object, which is our error message. Cool. Now after we have completed and we get a response, we can now set the register loading here to be false again. Okay, so after we have completed this request, we can say that our registration has stopped happening. So I'll say here false, and after that we will either log in the user or we will show an error message. Okay, so that is what will happen. Cool. Now that we have this function, where will we use this particular function? We will use it in our register form. So let's go to pages here and register. We will make use of that function whenever we are submitting our form. So let's make sure that we are exporting it from this particular file. So I'll come down here and I'll pass our register function. So I'll say register user, and also I'll pass our register error. So in case of an error, we'll be able to access it. So I'll save, and then I'll now jump into my register here, and what I'll do, I'll bring in our register user function and also our register user. How was it? Let me check. Let me just copy. Okay, register error. I can just type it out. So this will either be null or it will be an object. Cool. Now when submitting the form, we should be calling this function. So here is our form, and we will fire an event on submit event. So I'll say on submit, and we call our register user. So we don't need to pass any data because the data is available in our register info, which is already being handled right here. Now the other thing that we can do is to handle our error message, this one. So right here we can perform a check if we have an error. If we have an error, we show this plus the error. Right here we can get out of JSX using the curly brackets, and I'll say register error, and we check if we have the error property. If we do, that is when we go ahead and show our alert. So I'll say if that exists, and let's have now this alert here. So I'll cut it and paste it here, and if we do, then we can now show the message here. So right here I will remove that, use curly brackets again, and we will have our register error, and now that means that we have a message. So we show the message here that is coming from our backend. I save. So now we are clearly showing the message. Now also here we should be showing a loading status. So let's also export is register loading. We didn't export that. So right here is register loading. I actually go ahead and copy that. I save that file, go to register, and then right here we bring it in, and I come to the button here. So we conditionally render this text. So I'll use the square brackets here, and I'll say is register loading. So this will either be true or false. Is register loading. So if that is true, then that means that the process of registering a user is happening. So I'll say creating your account, or you can just say loading, and right here we say register in case the loading is not happening. Cool. I save. Now we have that set up. Now the other thing that we should do is that we should prevent the form from refreshing the page. So right now, if we try to register, you'll see that it will not happen. If I register, you see the form is refreshing. So when we call this function like this using the onSubmit event, we will be having access to our event object. So right here in our register user, we'll have access to event, and we can use this event to prevent the form from refreshing the page. So after this, we can just say e dot prevent default, and we call that particular method. I save, and now we should be able to perform a HTTP request to our backend server. So let's make sure that our server is running, only the front end is running. So right here, I'll get out of client cd, then I think double dots will get me out of client, then we cd to the server, and we use nodemon to run the server. So it's starting our node.index.js, and there we go. Our server is running, front end is running. Let's go ahead and try to register a user. So first of all, I'll just submit the form when it's empty and see if we get an error message. Submit, creating an account, all fields are required. Amazing. And now this is coming from our custom error messages that we had included at our backend. Okay, let's include a name now. We can register John, so I'll say name here is John. Then email, we can say John at gmail.com, and then we set a strong password. Okay, now let's try to use a wrong email. We are just checking if these error messages are working here, and it complains. So this is now from HTML. Let me remove this full stop. Then I check all fields are required. Okay, something is wrong because we have included all the fields, and our form is not updating the status. So register info, everything is there, but it's still giving us this error. Okay, at our services.js, if we try to log this body to the console, you'll see that we don't have any data that we are getting to it. Okay, let me show you. So right here, let's just use some dummy data, maybe Chaoo. Then we pass an email and some dummy data here. So at our register info, we have the data, yes, but if we register here, all fields are required. And if you check our body output here, name is empty, email is empty, password is empty. So the thing that we should do is that at our auth context, we were able to create this function, and we made use of callback to optimize our function. So although this function is being called only when it first renders. So when we perform change to register info, it's taking the old one right here, the initial state. So we should be able to call this function even after this state changes. Therefore, we can specify at our dependencies that let's also be able to call the function with the updated state. So right here, you can just pass this register info right here so that we get the updated data. I hope that makes sense. Now, if we try it out, let's see. Right here, we'll have the name. Then we will have email. Let me paste that one. Then dummy password. So the password is not strong. We should still get an error, but at least a different error. So I register, and you'll see user with the given email already exists. And now at our body output, we have the data. So that was the issue initially. So now from our services, I can go ahead and remove this console log and save. So the other error is actually working. We are able to see that the user already exists. Now let's register a new user. I'll say John, then right here I'll say John at Gmail. Let's omit dot so that we see if it will perform the check. Then a strong password, and if I register it will complain about email. Email must be valid email. If password is not strong enough, so email is valid but password is not strong enough, password must be a strong password. And if the password is strong enough, we will be able to actually get to register this user. So I'll hit register, creating account, and now nothing happens, but we are successfully adding this user to the local storage and also to the state. So it's also available in state. We are not logging that state out, the user state. But if we go to application right here, then we go to local storage, you'll see that we have this user right here, and we have the email, we have the name, and we are getting a token and the ID of this user. So we are successfully registering this user and adding the user to the database. So that is amazing. Now next, whatever we will do, we will log in the user. So I'll see you in the next one.